You're very welcome, everyone, this evening to this event as part of the Humanitas Visiting Professorship Program involving Athol Fugard. We have a discussion planned here this evening with Janet Suzman, the actress, John Carney, who has written with, worked with, collaborated with Athol, who is an actor and also a playwright, and then our visiting professor, Athol Fugard himself. What we were thinking of doing is making this fairly informal and relaxed, having some discussion here on stage amongst the three, and then opening up to you, the audience. But could I just say, first of all, on our joint behalves, a very, very warm welcome to Athol Fugard, to Janet Suzman, and also to John Carney. You're very, very welcome. I'm here as simply the moderator and to, keep the ball of commentary questions bouncing between our three guests. My name is Elika Burma, and I'm here in the English faculty. I'll hand over to you now with the opening question, perhaps to get us talking. Perhaps we can think back to how theatre was in the 60s, what the theatre scene was, Athol, where you began and where John also began, and then Janet, as I understand, you left the country, born in Johannesburg, left the country to pursue your acting career in London. Could you take us back to the 60s and give us a feel for that time?
I'm going to bounce the ball in John's direction very quickly, but there's going to be a little preamble. John Carney and Winston and Shauna, very young men, joined the Serpent Players group, which was then in existence, and participated in our early attempts at playmaking and things like that. And then at a certain point, the two of them came to me with the most lunatic request I had ever heard of, which was, suggestion that they wanted to be professional actors. Now, you've got to understand that to be a professional black actor in South Africa at that point in time was like asking, I don't know, what was it like asking, Janet?
A cow to jump over the moon.
Yeah, it was like asking the cow to jump over the moon. And I tried to dissuade them, but they were very, very insistent. And, they wanted to try to be actors, professional actors, earning a living. They both had jobs during the day. And anyway, I finally was persuaded by them to give it a go. And coming out of that were the two plays called Sizwe Bonzi and The Island. Plays which eventually ended up in the West End and on Broadway. But I would like to remind John, and maybe that will be the point in time for me to bounce the ball back to him, that his first ever performance of Sizwe Bonzi was in a garage for 3 domestic servants. Because we had no theatre to go to. We had nothing. We had no resources of any kind. What was it like, John?
Well, one of the 3 domestic workers walked out. Emily
Dollery,
who worked for the Dollar Family, because she said we were playing with something that was very hurtful to her. She had tried for years to bring her son to join her in Port Elizabeth. And because of the past laws, the Group Areas Act and influx control, if you lived in Oxford and you want to go and work in London, it's impossible. You have to work as a black person in Oxford. If you fall in love with someone who lives in Birmingham, you got to work this thing out, because both of you are not allowed. I'm not allowed in Birmingham. She's not allowed in Oxford. So it was a deterrent even in falling in love. So the one lady walked out because she said we were playing with the truth. Now, just to, the history of this group is that they heard that Athol, who had been working in the 50s in Johannesburg, in Sophia Town, with actors like Denbo, Mishek Musia, Ken Gampu, Zakes Mukai, and they had been making and creating work where Athol wrote one of the great, the original plays in the township. Before we even talked about township theatre. And those were the Nongogo, the No Good Friday, which Sheila used to refer to them as Athol's flops.
But Sheila's my wife.
So when Athol came to Port Elizabeth, this group of actors went to see him and said, would you join the group and work with us? Now, when I came to the group, it was in 1965, they were doing a play called Antigone by some strange guy called Sophocles. And I was in the movement. At that time, it was the time people were being recruited to leave the country. So I walk in and I had no communication with white people. White people were policemen not wearing uniform. Because they were whites in uniform. When they were in plain clothes, they were very suspicious of them all the time. So Fats Bukholan and Nomhle introduced me, and there was Athol smoking the pipe. And he said, oh, sit down. I thought, oh, he's not even saying, what's your name? He just sit down, take the script, read. And I was looking at him thinking, here we go again. One of them white people that work with black people, and they say, I know them. And I sat there listening to Athol talk about Antigone, Sophocles, the challenges. Was the state right to refuse Antigone to bury her brother Polynices? Or was Antigone right to challenge and break the laws of the state and do what is right? It sort of sat in the center of my political growth, being groomed within the struggle. So suddenly we're not talking about this play, which is Antigone, a Greek old play. We're talking about the state, about justice, about what is right, what is wrong, what is legal, what is illegal. I said, this white man's not bad. I think I like him. And that was the beginning of that process, me working with Athol. We followed that with the coat.
But I want to interrupt you, only because I've always wanted to know how you began to work on those themes, the Sophocles and the prison, and join them together into one of the great plays of the 20th century, The Island. I want to know the process, please, because I wasn't there.
That process started with one of Serpent players. How many Serpent players ended up on Robben Island? Because the police were watching us at that point in time. They came into rehearsals, they would try to intimidate, they took away the scripts, which is why for a long time there was absolutely no script of Cesare Bonzi in existence, because that way the police couldn't get hold of a document and ban it. For as long as it was in their two heads and in mine, we were safe. So a lot of poetry in Russia survived that way, incidentally. But anyway, we lost players to Robben Island. And one of them was an actor who was going to play Haman, who was going to play Creon's son. And for him, the play was as passionate and real, a possibility to articulate what was in their hearts as it was for John. And on Robben Island, he refused to, his frustration with having lost the opportunity to do the play was so great that when the prison concert came around, he persuaded a fellow inmate in the cell with him to do a two-man version of it lasting 10 minutes. And that was it. And that is how The Island, in fact, ends. For those of you who don't know the play, it's firstly what we learned about the conditions in the Robben Island, the way the warders treat the prisoners there. But at the end of it, there is the concert. And the concert is the 10-minute version of Robben Island that was staged A 10-minute version of
Antigone.
that was staged in Robben Island.
But in working on it, was it largely from improvisation that, for instance, you got that long preamble to the play with the hard labour and stuff like that?
Well, one of the things the prisoners were forced to do, they were forced to take on in an attempt to break their spirit. I mean, the whole system was geared at trying to break the spirit which the warders and the prison authorities and the police knew very well was still intact, that somehow nothing of what they had done to these people yet was enough to have broken that sense of resistance they had to the system. And so they would literally get prisoners involved in absolutely pointless work. Push over that tree with your forehead. Empty the sea, dig a hole in the beach and empty the sea into it. And for a whole day, a prisoner would have to go through that charade of work, trying to do something that was absolutely impossible and absurd.
But to squash that into a play is the genius of it.
Well, the Broadway producers, when they first, because John and Winston were extraordinary, they almost put the audience through the same experience because they took a long time to exchange loads of sand between two piles. I mean, my instruction was, listen, empty this pile of sand there, which happened to be Winston's pile. And I said to Winston, you empty your pile here. So the two actors were just all the time doing absolutely pointless thing. And we didn't do it just as an illustration of what the event was. This is the important thing. We made it an experience. We tried to make it an experience for the audience to watch labor of monumental absurdity.
When we began, we started at the back of the garage with bottles.
That's right.
There was a bottle of Cokes and many bottles that side, and one at that side. Now, Winston is a wonderful human being, a brilliant actor, but hell to live with. So I take my pile and I put it there, and Winston takes the same pile and puts it there. So first we enjoyed it, was fun, but we were always waiting for Arthur to say, that's enough now, go into the cell. And he's sitting there, he's saying nothing. So we then, okay, we're going to do it fast. So the faster I take my lot there, the faster he brings it back. And then one bottle breaks, and he's got a tiny cut on his hand, which was bleeding. You would imagine the blood was pouring out of his hand in liters. And he was swearing in course, and Athol is not even looking at us. Up until the point we were so tired, and we said, if he doesn't say go to the cell, we're going in the cell now. And that's when Athol said, okay, in the cell. So that process, you know, of...
Yeah.
Because my uncle, Harry, was on Robben Island. And he used to tell me a story of they would have these rocks on the wheelbarrow with the iron wheel. And they would move these rocks from there and drop them on the other side. But they would load the rocks so high on this thing that he was very short and very stouty. And every time he lifts the wheelbarrow, it falls on the side. And the water says, yeah, Kani, you want to run a country. You can't run an F-wheelbarrow. So those were the things in our minds. But as soon as we got into the cell, then began the process. And I remember Athol saying, we had done Antigone before with George Mngci, you know, the one you directed, Nomhle Nkonyeni.
Yes, yes.
Before. So this time, Athol forced us to remember that trial of Antigone without going to Antigone. We must remember and make it up, you know, and he's sitting there making those notes and talking to us. And we also remember that Shak never knew his lines.
Sharky never knew his lines.
So I was quite amazed that if Shak is now on Robben Island doing a two-man performance of Antigone, he never knew his lines. That's why when Shak was arrested, it was my first speaking part with the Serpent Players.
You played Haymon, that's right.
I played Haymon.
So this is the 60s that you're improvising, that you're putting this play together. When does it go to Broadway? Can you tell us about that process of it
Well,
moving out from
firstly,
there?
we have the huge debt of gratitude we have was to two people, Yvonne Bryceland, who dead now unfortunately, a South African actress who I worked with for 20 odd years.
Your muse, one of your muses.
Yes, one of my muses. That's right. Thank you, Janet. That's an extraordinary talent, a lady of courage, absolute courage. She would take a performance right to the edge. She would live as dangerously as she could on a stage for every second of it, of that performance. But anyway, it was Yvonne Bryceland and her husband, Brian Asbury, started a little theatre, and it was the first really significant attempt at an alternative theatre in South Africa. They gave it the name The Space. It was a loft space, which they turned into a small intimate theatre. And at that point in time, a club theatre, as was the case in London when the Lord Chamberlain was still crossing out bad, rude words in scripts and all of that. The way the arts theatre used to work, somewhere near Covent Garden. Where was the arts theatre? Can anybody remember? The old arts theatre? Anyway.
Still there.
Huh?
Come back again. Banton Street.
Was it? Yeah, something like that. But anyway, in South Africa, by virtue of being a club theatre, we could have mixed audiences. And we could have mixed casts, because then already the Group Areas Acts and various pieces of legislation were in place which prohibited a mixing of audiences and actors on a stage, among other things. I mean, there was one critical moment in the history of Serpent Players when we were invited by an amateur drama group to show our work to the... were you with the group? Yes, you were with the group. Yeah. And they wanted us to come and present because they'd heard about our activity. We'd already had a little following in the townships. And they wrote and said, but there's one condition. Please come, and without saying it as quite as crudely as that, they said, would you see to it that everybody has a pee before, relieves themselves before they come, because they can't use our toilets. When this condition was spelt out to the group, it was an extraordinary moment. It was a really extraordinary moment. We finally decided to accept the invitation. And what did we do, John? Can you remember the coat?
Yes. We were doing the coat.
We did the coat.
Yeah, and Athol told us the conditions that we are not allowed to use the toilet facilities. We're not allowed to use the ante-rooms, which were the dressing rooms. We cannot enter the down hall in the main entrance, which other white patrons would use. We would come in on the goods side, and there will be no communication between us while performing this thing with the audience before and after. And the last one was because there was a white by night law. After 9 o'clock, a black person cannot be in the white Port Elizabeth city without a permit written by the master or the madam saying that this is why you are this late. Otherwise, you'll be arrested under white by night. So at the end of the performance, it said it does not exempt them from the white by night law. So Athol says, so what do we do, guys? And we thought, what's wrong with him? We can't perform under those conditions. We are not going to do this. This is an insult, and we're all militant. And we all said no. And then Athol said, guys, this is an opportunity. We've been playing to people who believe and are supportive of us, black universities and nice white liberal audiences. This is an ordinary audience. It's the theater appreciating audience. So I will read on your behalf. So we all left very angry. So I was at home, and I thought, this is an opportunity. I'll go and read with Athol. So I get in the bus, and I arrive at the terminus, and I see Mulligan. He had also decided on his own that he will read with Athol. By the time we got to this hall, we were all there. And all of us had made a decision to go there. It was an unbelievable experience.
Yeah.
And then the transition to America, to Broadway?
Then so in the Space Theatre, they gave us a chance to present our plays. And I can still remember the occasion on Robben Island when we climbed onto a table and looked through a little fan light and we could see the island in the distance. And it was like a blessing on the performance. At that moment, they were there. And we had a special branch in that audience. They asked if they could come and watch. Where they had to get permission from us, of course. But they came, and they watched. And so from there, where did we go from there? I think it was to the Royal Court Theatre in London.
Wright.
Yes, Nicholas Wright and Oscar Lowenstein gave us a chance to present our plays at the Royal Court Theatre in London. And this was joined by another sort of semi-improvised work that I had created with Yvonne Bryceland called Statements After an Arrest Under the Immorality Act. Yvonne and myself acted in that, but for the Royal Court season, Ben Kingsley played the role. And then from the Royal Court, it went to the Ambassadors on the West End. And then to Broadway, which ended with John and Winston receiving Tonys for their performances.
Fantastic. And what year was that?
We won the 74-75 season.
74-75. And Janet, where did you come into this, as it were, the Fugard moment? Did you have a sense of Athol's work at that point in time?
I did, having come here to get the hell out, which was basically what everybody... Well, I was at Wits University, so I was doomed with a sort of semi-education. And it was the fashion then for everybody to get out. And there was tremendous amount of arrests and trouble and police on the campus, and because those were the years they brought in something called, we called it the Academic Apartheid Bill, but they called it the Extension of University Education Act. And I don't remember going to lectures at all. We just were on the lawn outside the library in the Great Hall constantly, every day, with a police presence strongly on campus, boycotting and protesting. Nobody wanted this bill to go through, but of course it did. But so it was a very troubled time, and I remember putting down my pen with sweaty palms, because in South Africa they do things at the proper end of the year. You write your exams at the end of the year. December. It's hot.
That's right.
Right? Hot. And I put down my pen and had wangled myself onto a arts faculty tour, and we flew from Johannesburg to Athens. I will never forget this. To a crystalline day where I could see Sophocles writing his plays. And from thence I was introduced to Europe, and I just didn't come back because I decided that I must pursue this acting thing. It intrigued me.
But I have a very clear memory of driving from centre of Port Elizabeth to our little house down at Schoenmakerskop with you and Barney.
Me, right. And I met him first there. There was a bit of a drinking party going on, I remember.
Yes. Do fill us in on that story.
I met this young man, and we were both quite young then.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And we had the most terrible fight, didn't we? And it was about language. And I remember John shouting at me, saying, you can't even speak my effing language. And I said, well, you're the winner, because you can speak mine. And it's true. But I said, nobody taught us this language. I mean, but because there was definitely a spark there, I have loved him since then, enormously.
Now, the problem with Janet, what she didn't know is that although we were artists working and being mentored by Athol, when we went back to the township, we were part of the movement, the underground. So we're very politicized. And I remember one time I was so angry at something, and then Athol said to me, "You're very angry. Listen, I can't make a bomb, therefore I can't teach you how to make a bomb. I can only teach you to write and act. But anyway, if you ever learn to make that bomb, you are so tight, when you put the fuse, you will blow yourself." So there goes, we're sitting there, and Janet is talking about, I said something in Xhosa to Winston or somebody on my right, and she said I was rude to speak that language when we know they don't. Wow, my God, I said, for 300 years, you have been rude to me, and I made it a huge political statement. She didn't give an inch. She screamed back, and I shouted back, and Athol was laughing. And in the end, we were tired of screaming at each other. And then we looked at each other and I said, "All right then, what is it you want to say? Do you want to know what I said to Winston? We're saying we like you." And thus began a relationship, you know. And because Athol was the real first white person I've ever had a relationship with, on the context of not in the post office or police station or wherever, insurance salesman. So my first real contact with someone on the other side was Athol. Later in my life, I said he messed up my revolution, because I found that there were good white people who were committed to the struggle and for decency in just human beings. So what's going to happen when that time comes? I can't kill him. What if there's more people that are like him? This then began to create a problem in my revolution.
Speaking of revolution and thinking of states of emergency, can we move forward a little bit to when things get really difficult and very divided around the late 70s, Soweto, and then into the 80s and the states of emergency?
Janet?
No, because I wasn't there. I came back at the end of the 80s with this Othello idea.
Could we talk about
but
that?
Maybe John should talk about that interim.
The interim, the interregnum.
The 70s were very difficult, because we would go to Athol's place, and then Athol would take us back at the end of each session. Remember when we were stopped near the entrance in New Brighton, Athol? Yeah. And then the police stopped us and we all got out. Nomhle Nkonyeni, one of the actresses, was sitting in front, and we were all sitting at the back in Athol's car. You could only go to the border where the township begins, or the industrial area. And the policeman asked Athol, "Does your wife know this Kafir bitch is sitting in the front seat?" And Athol said, "Of course, then I don't know. Sheila wouldn't mind." He says, "That's what we're asking, whether she would mind or not." Does she know? And then those were the days, and so it was very difficult. And Athol also was constantly being raided at home, house, and all the thing. And when we met at Athol's place, we could see the security branch walking up and down. It's this very small street, Schoon microscope, that area where we stayed. So people knew each other. So if there's any one black person, even a white person walking up and down, we already knew that person did not belong there. And most of the plays we did the Bacchae by Euripides, and we did all these Greek plays, and just in the township, Les Justes by Albert Camus, and when we would be picked up. And the thing that was very difficult was how the security tried to plant and sow disinformation amongst ourselves, the mistrust. And those were the days of the only way the white minority government could succeed was they had an incredible, impenetrable network of informers within the black township. So if you want to destroy someone, his life almost took that person to be killed, you only have to accuse them of being an informer. And when we performed our little plays, the Trials of Brother Jero in Coston, and with those plays, the police would come. Remember when we took Athol to the township with his woolen hat and we were performing Caesar Vanzi for the first time at the St. Stephen's Church Hall.
Well, that was a never to be forgotten experience. I mean, I don't know if there's ever been theatre as such as we experienced that evening. The play had already...
Which play was it?
Sisme Bonzi is dead.
Yeah.
And the play had already gone overseas. And so the news had come back that this play was a huge success. And for the first time in New Brighton was going to be given a chance to see this play. I mean, that title, as far as the New Brighton audience is concerned, you know, is enough. And the people started coming, and the police started coming as well, of course. But by at least 10, 15 minutes before we were due to start our performance, and facilities were very primitive. I mean, I switched the lights on and I switched the lights off, and that was our lighting effect, but lighting design. But the point was that we were jam-packed already in the hall, so people started to sit in the fan lights up on the side of the walls. It was extraordinary. And then the performance began. And at a certain moment, and the audience knew that the police were outside. So there was already a feeling of panic and terror at what was going to possibly happen that evening. And when John, in the course of the play, persuades or tries to persuade Winston to change his identity in terms of the passbook, that a hated symbol of the apartheid laws, people in the audience thought, this is when, excuse the expression, but there's no other one that does justice to it, the shit hits the fan. And they stood up and made for the exits. And stopped for one last look at the stage, and John and Winston just carried on, and slowly they came back to their seats, and then the debate started between, firstly, in terms of this issue, do you sacrifice your identity so that your wife can come and be with you in the town, so that your children can come and be with you in the town, so that you can find a job that will earn enough money to feed them and clothe them in the town? Because that was the issue involved in losing your identity. If you jettisoned the name of and became the dead man, Robert Zwellinzima, good things were going to happen. And as the debate between John and Winston developed on stage, people in the audience started contributing to the debate. And at some point, the situation was so rowdy that a gentleman jumped up onto the stage and said, listen, this meeting is getting out of hand. and he literally then ran an impromptu meeting. He did what Elke is trying to do tonight with three really rowdy people. You know, he ran a meeting, and people got the chance to say who they agreed with and who they disagreed with and get it out of them. And when everybody had had a chance who wanted to speak had spoken, he said, right, back to you, John and Winston, finish the play. It was an unbelievable experience. I sat there.
Maybe that's how theatre ought to be.
Well, that is exactly right. That is exactly right. That is what our Bertie Brecht tried to do with his theatre, you know, what he preached that theatre should be. It was extraordinary involvement in a community in terms of a document, a piece of paper that we had all contributed to anyway. So there we are.
So the theatre kept the spark going between the two of you and the other actors in that very difficult situation of the 1980s. Yeah.
But perhaps you guys ought to talk about why the market theatre happened then in the mid-70s.
Exactly, yeah.
Huh?
Well, that was Barney Simon and Manny. And they started because...
They wanted another space in Joburg.
Yes, I know. Right. They had both, you know, worked in theatre, but it was Yvonne Bryceland and Brian Asbury's effort in Cape Town that spurred them on.
That's right.
To find a venue, which is the extraordinary market theatre that exists today, and to start work there. And that is where John and I then, because went on to do a lot of work.
And we opened, didn't we open with The death of Bessie,
No,
I can't say it.
we
The
opened
death
with-
of Bessie Smith.
We opened with Maratsat. The market opened with Maratsat.
Oh, that's
Remember
right.
on our way to Australia with Sandra Prince of Janice Hanneman, we were watching Maratsat. And I was sitting and thinking, what the hell is this play about? But there was a moment when Sandra Prince comes to the front of the stage and says, what kind of people are these? In that madness in that place. Then, of course, Barney came to Port Elizabeth. And you know, Barney was very mischievous. We used to order, structure, commitment. When you work with Athol, it's a dangerous situation. And Barney was playful. And we thought, come on, guy, what's this guy? He's a Jewish guy. What's wrong with us? Look, we got work to do. And Barney would play around because we used to work in a disciplined fashion. Then later, 1977, Barney wanted to do The Death of Bessie Smith. And then Janet and I got together again with Winston. And that was an experience. How the audience is also like at the market watching a mixed cast.
Yes.
Also watching this conflict and confrontation between us. And also Barney's notes. Barney's notes. Barney once said to Janet, you know, Janet, that's it. And Janet looked at Barney and went back, and then we did a scene again. And Barney said, no, Janet, I feel like you've just swallowed the whole world. And Jesus, she exploded. Barney, what the F do you want to say? Can you give a bloody note? What is it you want me to do? And Barney said, that. That. Those were like, the Market Theatre was there, and when the security came and they looked at the theatre and they asked Manny and Barney to apply for what was now becoming to be called an international license. Now, the international license measures the aisles. The aisle must be about 1.5 meters wide so that a black person and a white person can go down the aisle without touching.
I didn't know that.
Yes, that's international license.
I never heard.
And then there is the seating. We had to lose a seat. So if I'm sitting here, the elbows mustn't touch.
I didn't know.
Yes, that's international license. So you could lose this seat and lose that seat. But then Raymond Tucker said, nah, don't apply for it.
He's a lawyer.
He was our lawyer trustee, and he found a piece of paper in 1937 when the building was opened. It was an Indian fruit and vegetable market. But the stall holders were white. They brought the produce. There was also pheasants from Newcastle, which came in with Newcastle sickte disease, which then they were outlawed. So, but colored and black and Asian stall holders could come into the building and buy the produce to sell in the black community. Therefore, there was a special permit for black stall holders to come into the building and buy the produce from white farmers to sell it in the black community. They could not stop the market operating because of that law. Now, when the audience finished seeing a play, there was a bar. The law forbade black people to drink with white people in the bar. We get a bit randy when we've had a lot to drink. So Graham Lindop came with a wonderful idea. There was one of the trustees who was called Andrews Stewart, Andrews McLean. He bought the bar for R1 and called it Andrews Bar, which meant the bar was private. And the invitation to the bar was the ticket, the half stub of the ticket. So if you had seen the play, you can go to the bar. So that's the only way we sort of went around the law, so we could also have a drink. So those were the state of emergency became so harsh.
This is the theatre of the absurd.
Yes, certainly.
The theatre of those days was so harsh because the government was determined to obliterate any form of resistance. The Bicos in 1977 dying, the T-malls dying, the young people being arrested, people leaving the country, and the country really, there was a point where we all felt it's a lost cause. But it was only the artists and the people in the theater who felt we got to keep that flickering flame of hope going on. Yeah. And one of the things I will never forget in my 7 years of life is what I got as a gift from Athol. 3 words: the truth, trust, hope. And he said, if you just could hold on in those 3 words, and that has been, for me, the mandate in everything I do, even in my existence, those 3 little words that you gave me as a gift: truth, hope, and trust. And every time we would improvise or work on something, and you said hope, and Athol would say, that's a big word. That's a big word. And first it was some nice thing to say, trust, that's a big word. But as I grew older and I realized the only way we managed to continue the resistance in South Africa, to continue that rise against apartheid, was those 3 words, because without it, we were killing each other.
Speaking of hope and trust, shall we talk a bit, Janet, for a moment about the Othello production and how that was, bringing that to the Market Theatre?
I wasn't one of those expatriates that abandoned my motherland, ever. I always was drawn and drawn and drawn and drawn back to it. And I used to go back every single year, really, after drama school, having joined the Royal Shakespeare Company. And what I was learning here in England was something that was still, I think, a sort of miracle, which was to learn to get to grips with this very great language. And it was because I joined the Royal Shakespeare Company at the time it was really flourishing in its first great season with the Wars of the Roses with Peter Hall and Peter Brook, that extraordinary history cycle, a State of the Nation examination of England really at the beginning of the 60s, which eventually grew to these 7 history plays, Richard II to Richard III. So you could see a different history play every single night of a week at Stratford. That was my induction into Shakespeare. And I cannot tell you, and John Barton, of course, the great John Barton. I can't tell you how much I learnt. And it was that, I suppose, that many years later I was able to draw upon when I went back one April day to Johannesburg, and I saw John in a play at the Market. I always went back to the Market because I felt home was there in a way because of my relationship with Barney Simon and him and other actors there. And I saw John in a play and I thought, God, you deserve something better than this. And nestling flew through my ear and stayed in my brain, and it was called Othello. It just stayed there and fluttered around like a little bird in a nest. And I couldn't get rid of this susurration in my brain. And I went home that night and I found on my mother's bookshelf a folio version of Othello, you know, with all those Fs. Really difficult to read, actually. And I read through Othello, and Act 3, Scene 3, I found the speech I wanted, which I still call the apartheid speech. It's where Iago whispers into his ear that enormous speech about the unnaturalness of mixing out of your own clime, complexion, and degree, wherein we see in all things nature tends. We may smell in such a will most rank, foul, disproportion, thoughts unnatural. Well, that was grand apartheid. The whole idea that it was unnatural for races to mix, and therefore they must be kept apart. And there it was as if Shakespeare was prefiguring, in the whole first third of that play, he talks about the unnaturalness of breaking what is true, what people see as being true to nature. So I knew this was the play we had to do. Here was Shakespeare, the protest playwright. And if you look at the The plot of Othello, it's quite simple. A black man is humiliated by a white thug. That's it. That's Othello. And so I went the very next morning to the market and I found John and I said, we have to talk because we've got to do this play. The only thing you have to be strong about is I want to direct it. So I felt him lurch slightly, but he was too much of a gentleman to actually faint. And then we embarked on this adventure together. The point that we had to convince, we wanted very much to do this in the proper way. And therefore we had to find permission from the ANC in exile, from the culture desk. That we had to convince them that this dead white European male was actually a protest playwright. Because that's how we needed to see him. And eventually we were persuasive enough for them to say, go ahead. The interesting thing was, on the other side, these Calvinist policemen did not have, under any subclause, Shakespeare as a protest playwright. Shakespeare was kind of, you know, godlike. So they could not come in and disrupt us doing a Shakespeare play. So there was a kind of strange standoff, wasn't there? They didn't actually break the doors down. But we were very... To do an incendiary sort of a play, which because it has at its core a very sexual element, it's about sexual jealousy. And I think probably before Hollywood, we had a black man and a white woman embracing on stage in public in Johannesburg. I can't think of a single film out of Hollywood where that happened. You can imagine the heat really in the building, the seat slamming up and the doors opening as people in dudgeon left. But just to bring up this thing about the audience vociferation, it was a huge lesson to me because whereas in Europe, if you say to an actor, you could have heard a pin drop. That silence is the greatest accolade an actor can expect on a European stage. In Africa, it's the reverse. It's really spooky. That kind of silence is like something's wrong.
Something's wrong.
Something's wrong. Nobody does silence like this. It's not right. It's like the lights have been fused or something. And so at high moments of the tragedy, there is noise from the audience, not silence. And this turns everything inside out because you realize that untutored audiences who have not been told you must behave in a theatre, behave very spontaneously. And it was the only place you will see that in England or Britain today is at a pantomime, where people say, look out behind you, and stuff like that, you know, because it's like part of the game. And that used to happen in the run of Othello. People couldn't bear it when Iago took his knife out and stabbed Emilia in the last act, stuff like that. The danger of the thing becomes very expressive.
It's coming up to the time where we'd like to, I think, move out to the audience and open for questions. But just before we do that, and thinking of turning things inside out, I mean, you've talked, all three of you, very, very compellingly about the kind of the energy that came from resistance, the danger that came from the drama. What did 1994 bring to all three of you, really, in terms of your dramatic practice, in terms of the theatre? It was a marvellous release and an important moment of freedom. How has that impacted on your work?
Actually, it started in 1990, because suddenly, as you were watching on television, Mandela being released, that release was kept so secret that even the people within the movement and the structures did not talk about it or did not know. So I always say that there were almost 300 protest plays written in January demanding the release of Nelson Mandela. So when he walked out, they had to go to the shredder. The ideas we were writing and creating work as protest against the apartheid state suddenly became irrelevant. The critics, I always say, went to the funeral of protest theatre and we were not invited. And people began to say, that's over, protest is over, now Mandela is president, now you should write about the present, the Rainbow Nation, now work must be progressive. People with resources brought in all the old plays that they couldn't bring because of the cultural boycott. They brought in even Tom Jones, Michael Jackson in the music and everybody. And we as creative writers and writers who were groomed in the struggle, we found like in a space where we didn't know, what do we do? I remember the market I proposed we do The Odd Couple, you know, but just trying to find something that would bridge the gap of nothing happening. And many people, including white people, just walked out. And they said, I don't come to the market theatre to see something I can see on Broadway done much better or in the West End. I brought my friend because I told them this theatre is about South African work, the South African struggle. So we were really for quite a 93, 94, 95, wobbling quite a lot, not knowing actually what statement to make. And slowly we did settle down. I mean, and when the first kind of play that approached the issue of confronting forgiveness is when Athol wrote Playland. And Sean Taylor and I did this play, I remember, which was about this white young boy from the army, we call him Boss Befok, traumatized by the war. He's trying to find someone he could talk to and ask for forgiveness for what they did during the war. And as we came out of the theater with Sean, we went to the bar. And there was some black people waiting in the bar, and they said to Sean, did you mean it? And Sean said, what? He said, when you said to him, I'm sorry, did you mean it? And Sean, but it's a play, I'm an actor. And I looked at their faces. They were so disappointed at the fact that he didn't say he meant it. You know, but the writer meant it. So it's okay if you don't mean it, you're just an actor. And remember again when Tony Sher and Greg Doran did Titus and Andronicus, and at production at the Market Theatre. There's a group of miners who from Carltonville who have a manager who's very cultural inclined. He would take these 20 or 30 miners for a walk in Johannesburg, and they would shop and do things, but in the evening, they'll come and see a play. They'd seen My Children, My Africa, they'd seen Master Harold and the Boys, they'd seen Miss Julie, Miss Othello, they'd seen all those great plays, Waza Albert, things that make him. So when they saw Titus and Andronicus, they said they're very quiet, watching this play. And I joined them at the bar, and I said to them, what did you think of the play? And one of them says, he's a very good writer. Has he written any other plays? But then the question was, why did the actors pretend we were not here? I said, what do you mean? He said, they never looked at us once. That's the only thing we didn't like about it, was that the actors pretended we were not here.
But it was interesting. We were chatting in the car about this very thing. That Titus Andronicus in Johannesburg, at that moment, it's a play about justice being buried, isn't it? It's a play about moral chaos. And we'd just become a democracy. And so this play was so unsuitable. And everybody sat there going, no, we want to celebrate. But then it came here, and of course, everything changes where the sense of place, I'm with Peter Brook and all of us on this, the place you do a play is just so important, isn't it? Where it speaks to the audience that it's speaking to. And there, it spoke depression and misapprehension somehow. Here, it seemed to be speaking about South Africa. And it was, I think, very well received.
Very.
So I think that the place you do something resonates, makes the play resonate, just as the oppression in South Africa made Othello resonate with a completely different bell tone than when you see it here. And I think that's terribly important, like that night you were talking about. Like, you must talk now.
No, I think you chaps have said it for me as well. No.